the perspective here is suppliers wake up in the morning wanting to do business with their customers. Suppliers want to make everything you need. They want to take every PO you give them. They want to satisfy all of the purchase orders and the forecast, however crazy they may be. And all they really, in essence, they want is to provide a service and or a product, supply you the what you've ordered on time in full, and get paid and grow that business with you. That's what they want.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
This week on Power Supply, we speak with Abe Salloum, former senior executive with GE. So, Hayes, we're going to get an inside look into what suppliers deal with their suppliers. And, honestly, with everything that's going on with supply chain disruption today, I think, this could really, shine a light on what we're all going through every day.
I totally agree. And it is interesting because he does display the whole supply chain from beginning to end. He's really insightful, a great guy. And just trust me, he has a great analogy there for all of us at the end. So hang tight and listen to us.
We're going to be right back after a short break with Abe Salloum.
I'm Hayes Waldrop.
This is Garry Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A production of 17 Studios. You're listening to Power Supply.
Joining us now is Abe Salloum, former senior executive with GE, and we're going to be talking about supplier management, but we're going to be looking at this through a different lens, which is the lens of the supplier themselves. And obviously, they don't make everything in-house. They have to work with partners that give them parts and components and manufacture for the manufacturers that then bring these products to market. And so, Abe, I'm really excited to get that Wizard of Oz behind the curtain kind of feel here today. And I do think the transparency piece, especially during the pandemic, has been coming forward more and more. So I think there's a lot of conversations like this that are starting to happen, and where it was just kind of, hey, there's nothing to see here. We just get it to you. And so I'm really glad that you're going to share some of this insight with us today. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
It's my absolute pleasure. It's very nice to meet all of you guys.
Abe, I want to jump right in. I've got one quick question. And unfortunately, all the people that are listening to us right now, they don't get to see what we're seeing, but essentially we're on like a Zoom. And I'm looking at your incredible office, your library here. Tell me about what's behind you, because there might be 20,000 books. Tell me more about that.
Thank you. Thank you for asking the question. Look, it's a lifelong collection. And I speak 4 languages, and I read in different languages.
Okay.
I'm mesmerized when it comes to communication and dialogue and other cultures. I'm always interested. But more importantly, the problem is the more I learn, the more I realize how much I don't know. So I keep buying books.
All right.
Well said.
I think I just need to sign off. If you're doing 4 languages and read, I don't think I'm worthy, but I'm impressed.
Well, I speak 2 very well, a language meaning native, if you will, and then I conversationist in French and basic German.
I mean, I don't even speak English well, so.
That's great.
I kind of,
Y'all do real well down there, Hayes. Y'all do
I
real
speak
well
Southern. That's
down
about
there.
it. So anyway, Abe, thank you for hopping on here. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, hey, why don't you talk about your background with GE? I know we introduced you as a former senior executive, but in speaking with you leading up to the interview, you weren't just working in the healthcare division of GE, but you also have some experience with oil and gas. And I really want to start there because we've had a lot of conversations like, oh, you've had experience outside of the healthcare industry, like we did a recent one with an individual who had experience in sort of the food industry. And then they moved over, but with a new company. And what I'm really interested to hear about that makes your experience unique is being in another industry, but with the same company and then moving over to healthcare, because I think that almost gives you an even better frame of reference for the differences and similarities between the industries.
Absolutely. And this is what I think makes it that much more exciting. But if you'll allow me, I want to take a big step back and talk about how do I really see my 30-year journey in industrial manufacturing. I really had some very, very humble beginnings with Mazda Motor Manufacturing, where I really started as a line worker. I was going to school and I got a job and then grew within that industrial manufacturing study and learned a lot about what we really talk about today in terms of Kaizen, PDCA, lean, and all of what comes along with that. That was what was ingrained in me working at Mazda Motor Manufacturing. Did that for about 10 years. And then my next big bucket of knowledge, if you will, from a career perspective, was at a beloved company called TRW. TRW went from a Mazda four walls of the plant to this conglomerate at the time. Had an automotive division, a space and defense division. I was in the automotive division where we made airbag and safety system products, seat belts, chassis systems. And I learned that I needed to function outside of the walls of a Ford plant. I was a staff level and they had 150 plants, 13 divisions. That's what I learned about global process development and implementation. And problem solving on a global scale, not at a plant level, if you will. But then after TRW, I've been fortunate in every sense of the word with every company I've worked for. They're phenomenal organizations and smart teams. I then went from TRW to an expat assignment in Germany with Harman Becker, making complex electronics and navigation systems for the automotive industry. And from there, to your earlier point, I consulted for a little bit of time, then went into GE Oil and Gas. My God, was that a new learning experience with blow-up preventers and undersea drilling. And then from oil and gas, where I led advanced manufacturing technology and product quality, I went to GE Healthcare. In all three of those, whether Harman, oil and gas, and GE Healthcare, the common theme between all of them was transformation. Every company have had its own share of reflection and deciding, okay, how do we do things differently? And how do we leverage what we have, but also bring external perspective in order to get to the next level of performance? And we can talk more about those details as we move further into the dialogue.
What did you like the most about healthcare? Like once you landed there, because all those prior experiences, were not healthcare experiences, what did you like and what opportunities did you see right away?
Look, making seatbelt and airbags and anti-lock braking systems and electrical power steering systems is awesome. You're bringing product to market that is appreciated by consumers every day. And we used to say a failure in that space meant blood on the highway. And we paid very close attention to how do we design the product, how we industrialize the product, and how do we bring it to market. But healthcare was different. And that's basically the question is, look, I was working on saving lives in moments that matter. And that's not my axiom. That's GE slogan. Is you're working every day on making an ultrasound machine, a ventilator, a CT, a computer tomography machine, or an MRI for that matter, the division I led before I left General Electric. And you're in touch with the customers, whether it's the Mayo Clinic or Ohio State University, any one of these pioneers in their own space that shared with you firsthand information about how your product was influencing and affecting people's lives.
It's about the connection to the mission, right? Like the connection with the patient. Does it motivate the people on your teams differently? Sorry, Gary. Gary loves to talk about mission. I stole a natural question from Gary. But
it's all you ripped the thunder out of his heart right there. That was hard.
He can't be the only one that asked that question.
I feel like I've mentored well. I feel like I've mentored well to Justin. That's all I got to say.
He's just like, that's mine.
No, Abe, we talk about mission. I'm patient-centered all day long, and I love that you brought it up, and Justin was going right there. So, Justin, finish your question. I love it. You're rolling on this, and I love you hearing it. So,
I'm assuming that the people that you're working with are a little bit more connected to the higher goal and purpose of the manufacturing. Not that seatbelts aren't important and that safety of, everybody who's, riding or driving vehicles isn't important, but there's just something about healthcare that I feel like pulls people in a little bit closer. And I'm assuming, did you see that in the culture of that division versus the others?
It is working on something that is bigger than you. We all think when we are in the heat of the battle that we kind of gravitate above, if you will, the product, but not in healthcare. You're working on things that are far bigger than you, and you're influencing an outcome that has far-reaching consequences, real consequences, people-type consequences. I'll give you a quick example. During the pandemic, we make a ventilator, but our ventilator at GE, the R860 is, let's call it, it's very complex. It is an anesthesia machine and a ventilator. And it's too exuberant. You really didn't need all of these functionality if you needed the ventilator. And what we were asked to do is to actually, can we design and deliver a ventilator that is basic in nature just to provide it to those that needed it? And I know you guys were tracking and were hearing and listening on the news and that how we, in conjunction with Ford Manufacturing at the time, who is premier in terms of industrial manufacturing solutions, we were able to join hands, bring together a very basic ventilator, outstanding industrial manufacturing solution, and bring it to market in, I believe it was like 7 or 8 weeks. And unheard of in the finished medical device space. And we provided, I think, to my recollection, 60 or 70,000 ventilators that were given to FEMA for global distribution. My point is, what a mission. And what a phenomenal achievement.
Absolutely, Abe. And I love you tying in the fact of the human element and following the mission, to Justin's point. But when we start talking about that, and in the heat of the battle, you brought that up, and it reminded me of a couple different negotiation strategies. You're talking about a $20 million project in MRI. You're talking about ventilators. You're talking about different pieces of equipment to get to the end user to take care of our patients and our people in our hospitals and our ASCs and our critical access hospitals. How do you relay the message, and how do you work within the internal framework of the hospitals and the inherent risks of the raw materials that you're struggling with? How do you keep that moving forward when there are so many different issues we're running into in the supply chain right now, from OTO, and you used to be able to get a machine and once you sign the PO, 6 to 9 months, it'll be on site. I'm not hearing that anymore. How do you build that expectation to really support the mission, and how do you work with the risks and the teamwork and inherently with the hospitals?
Very good insight. It's not as complex as we may think it is, but it's not as straightforward as we really all want it to be. The supply chain today is really struggling. And struggling, in my opinion, because of, I'm going to say, traditional lack of focus on what's today we're calling supply chain resiliency, supply chain agility, building a reliable supply chain. Well, yes, and we're having to reflect on that now, but to work needed to be either in place that allows you to actually have that relative agility while keeping an eye, to your point, Garry, and have a greater deal of empathy as to what are you still designing and making and delivering to market. So it is a juggling act that is not difficult, but it takes a little bit of more than just talk. It takes a little bit more of ingenuity and support by the organization to actually make that happen. And we can deep dive that in the area of supply management if you'd like, but that's what I think.
Yeah, I want to jump on that. I think how much control does the average manufacturer actually have over that? Because you're talking about the adjustments that you have to make, but really the whole reason we're bringing you on is to talk about suppliers managing their suppliers. And so, what percentage of the materials, parts, et cetera, come from outsourced suppliers for the average manufacturer? I mean, it can only have so much control on being proactive internally, correct?
However, if you just want to put a little bit of perspective around this and set the scene, if you don't mind, the goal is not just to have supply chain connection, but the goal is to have, in my view, a supply chain partnership. And I want to emphasize the word partnership. So the perspective here is suppliers wake up in the morning wanting to do business with their customers. Suppliers want to make everything you need. They want to take every PO you give them. They want to satisfy all of the purchase orders and the forecast, however crazy they may be. And all they really, in essence, they want is to provide a service and or a product, supply you the what you've ordered on time in full, and get paid and grow that business with you. That's what they want. They don't want to short you on their deliveries. They don't want to cause problems. They don't want to have mishaps along the way. They are actually in the business of providing solutions and making a decent living and growing the relationship. There is, however, this wrong narrative on every part of, it depends on the industry, of the original equipment manufacturers, that if I give the supplier a PO and I tell them what I need, how come they just can't make it to volumes that I want? Well, because the fact of the matter is they're running a business. Nobody have idle installed capacity. Otherwise, they're just not thinking straight. They're not managing their capital investment. They're not controlling their return, their investment on assets. And they're allocating their available capacity based on forecasts they're receiving from their customers. So what does that mean? That means depends on how involved are you and the commitment you have towards supplier partnership, and how in touch are you with your suppliers is going to translate into do you have supply base resiliency and agility or not? Are they there and can they serve you based on forecasts that you provided or not? Do they understand what you really want them to do or not? So now Aaron said keep it to 120 seconds. So I'm like a little bit over.
Well, let me break this down a little bit too and chunk through it. So, and just for everybody who's listening, Aaron's our producer who's behind the scenes that you don't hear or see.
I wish you could see him because
I don't know why you stopped the camera.
He's the one who gets it done.
He has
so
devilish good looks. If we could only show him,
he looks like a country singer. He looks like
Luke Combs. Yeah, and he sounds better than Luke.
Yeah, he's our Luke Combs.
His beard is solid, dude. Just look at that.
He sings
I wish our
right
listeners
there.
could see that face right there.
Yeah.
Oh.
So, Abe, when we talked before, you said it was something like 70 to 80% on average of the material or supplies are outsourced, and that developing an internal framework is really critical. And it's really, you highlighted, we need to be proactive about this. It can't be something that we end up taking care of after the fact because all of that rework and inefficiency. And we know that about manufacturing. We know that they want to have a nice, lean, streamlined machine, right? And we've heard that for 50 years now. But I think the biggest thing is developing that internal framework, because when you're talking about all these different suppliers, and you said maintaining that communication and what's your relationship like with them, the more that human element of communicating with that 70 to 80% of the supplier base for the manufacturer, or the OEM might be a better way to kind of position, because they're all manufacturers, right? When you're talking about 70 to 80% and all those different relationships, obviously there's common breakdowns just due to human error. Or what if there's turnover? Does that impair the relationship and the communication between the OEM and their supplier? And so with all those things kind of in mind, I want to talk about some of the aspects of developing the internal framework. And, feel free to add something about that human element, and that internal framework to tee this up before we really dive into that.
100%. So look, every product has a bill of material of some sort. You've got to delineate your parts on a bill of material, and you got to communicate that internally and externally. On average, depending on the industry and product you're making, you range between 60 to 75, 80% in some cases. Unless you are vertically integrated, you're buying about 60 to 80% of your product from external suppliers. And that usually translates, depending again on the business, into about 50 to 60% of your revenue in terms of spend with your supply base. So the question I've always asked and reflect on in organization, when I look at how much attention is an organization paying to its supply base agility and supply chain resiliency, is what's the amount of energy you are actually employing that represents that BOM and that spend? And do you have then a framework around that to enable a better outcome? What the suppliers really need is they need an honest forecast, one that delineates your 3, 6, 12, 24, and 36 months look. Give me some confirmation on some of what I am seeing in terms of volume and commitment. And then let me go invest in capital and tooling and people to actually bring the product to you at the rate you're telling me I'm going to see it. So doing all of that within an organization with the assumption that we give a PO to the supplier, how come they cannot make what we want, has to somehow converge. And the convergence cannot be through, I'm going to send them an email and tell them what I want them to do. What I've seen some of the best in class do is to actually have a structure that is to a large degree based on a model that mirrors the product life cycle. So you design a product, you industrialize a product, you manufacture a product, and you service a product. So what should your supplier management structure look like that complements that product life cycle? And what I've seen, and I'll share with you, team, is you've got to spend time on proper selection of your suppliers. You've got to pick a supplier where their manufacturing and process technology roadmap matches yours, or complements yours, rather. You can't pick somebody who does not understand the space or the industry or the product and plug them in because they can, but the struggle is going to be high. And adaptability and resiliency is going to be difficult. So you got to spend time carefully selecting suppliers that allows for that resiliency and agility that you're looking for. And what we're seeing, for example, in the chip manufacturing space, what are we going to do? We're going to start making chips again. If you follow what I mean, we're not going to be as much reliance on single source type chip manufacturers and be at the mercy of that supply base. So Selection is extremely critical. The second phase, now that you selected the supplier, you got to develop them. Develop them does not mean hold their hand. Develop them meaning share with them product knowledge. So a couple more seconds on that. The supplier is an expert at a component level. A wire. They know how to make a wire, but they don't know how to make a magnet. So why is the superconductive wire, in terms of dimension and specification requirements, needed to have those level of tolerances to be put into an MRI? So unless you explain that and you walk them through that logic, through tools and standards that are out there, like your design FEMA and your process FEMAs, and you kind of articulate the critical to quality aspects of the product, they're not going to get it. And you're going to have problems. That's the human element breakdown. The third element of that model, so select, develop, and then monitor. You don't just award product and you issue PO and you walk away. It's like, I hate to say this on a podcast, it's like marriage.
This is exactly the format to make that kind of analogy.
This, subject, sir.
I don't. This might be on transmission control or something. We may need to move that to JP.
Dr. Full.
What's going to be hilarious is we're going to put this one out, and all of our comments are going to be about this analogy and not supplier management, resiliency, and gaining that alignment with.
Hey, can I jump in there right fast? Because you talked a lot about on the supplier side, the OEM side, and that whole transparency on that side of the equation. What about if I'm speaking had the voice for the Topeka, Kansas Medical Center? They want to know what you're doing. There is no transparency many times. What do you think about sharing the manufacturer side with the provider side? How do you side on that?
You cannot exclude the field, the install base, as they call it in finished medical device. You've got to keep that strong linkage and affinity coming back and forth. So if I was to spend, if you don't mind, 30 seconds on that. In the product life cycle model, you have design, industrialization, manufacturing, and install and service. And the end of life in finished medical device doesn't end. An MR lives for 15, 20, 25 years. A CT is used forever, if you will. So your customer need in terms of support is far greater than any industry that I've seen, at least in my journey. So you've got to keep what I call the right to left, meaning bringing information back from the field back into the product life cycle. And you've got to connect it with the left to right, meaning the MPIs feeding into the process and the field feeding back into the manufacturing system. That convergence between the two is absolutely fundamental. This is how you learn. This is how you decide on what the future releases of product and the need, while keeping strong affinity with the utilization of the product and the use case scenario that you see, your product performance, and your future designs.
Well, I like that. I just think it's important that the provider, the supplier, the OEM, there's transparency from beginning to end, because that's where there's a breakdown now. And I think and in so many other industries, it seems as if there is complete 100% transparency. And then unfortunately in healthcare, it doesn't seem that way. And hopefully we'll get there, and it'll help everybody out for planning. And, again, if we ever have another pandemic or something, we'll be that much more prepared.
And Hayes, you're right on. It's not transactional anymore. You cannot be transactional, or both entities will fail. You're so right on, Hayes. So great point.
It's like a marriage, you know. You got to all work together.
If I've learned anything, supply chain is like marriage. Marriage is like supply chain. That's what I'm hearing on today's call. So
here it is. Right? So the third step, monitoring, I said, it's like marriage. It's not just an event where you said, yes, I do, and you kind of walk away.
I get that. I do. You're basically, you're still on the marriage thing there. That's good.
You gotta work it. Otherwise you show up one day and there are bags at the door and you say, honey, whose bags they are? And they say, just said, they're yours. So suppliers do the same thing is what I'm trying to say. At one point, I had a supplier who will remain nameless to protect the innocent here. I took on this responsibility for a fantastic organization. And in the first like months, the chief technology officer knocks on my door and he says, we got a problem. I said, what's the problem? He said, this wire supplier doesn't want to take POs from us anymore. I said, okay, so we'll get another wire supplier. He said, no, you don't understand. This supplier is unique. Either this supplier or there's no product. So they told us, look, the bags are at the door. Bags, tools, your tools are at the door. Just come and take them. The question is, then when I dug into the problem is, what's the problem with the wire provider? They're an awesome organization. They're the specialist. They're the best in that space. And they said, look, for 5 years, you've been designing a product that didn't come. You've been promising me volumes that didn't materialize. I've invested in capital and in people. And here I am sitting on it now in a net loss. So my point is, you got to pay attention to your family, pay attention to your marriage, pay attention to your suppliers, create that line of communication, and be honest. Tell them that, look, design is still not ready. Support where needed. Gauge the capital investment. Don't tell them go do 100% capacity install and then run idle on that capacity for another 3 years. Suppliers don't have that kind of margins to protect and to throw.
I don't know what keeps popping in my mind, but this whole transparency discussion is being intentional. It just keeps coming up in my mind as being intentional with your supplier and just call it right out. Is the communication that needs to take place right now is intentional. Be honest and be sincere about it, and hopefully you get the reciprocating piece of that from your suppliers as well, because supply chain has changed. It's to your earlier comment about 25 minutes ago, transformation. It has occurred, and I do not believe it's going to go backwards. We have to move forward on this. So, love your comments on this.
Agreed.
Abe, this was a fantastic conversation. I actually, the more I've thought about the marriage analogy and the fact that you extended that out to the family, I kind of look at it like provider and supplier it's almost the Brady Bunch, really. It's provider and supplier are in a marriage, and both of them are bringing children to the marriage. And the OEM is bringing all of these suppliers to the marriage, and the provider is bringing all their patients to the marriage. And, for them to be a happy family, the patriarch and the matriarch got to make sure that it's working. And so I guess,
Justin, you're spot on. Now here's the problem. I think somebody listening to us is already thinking, what do you do with dual sourcing?
Yeah.
That's the problem.
That's a stepkid. That's the stepmom.
That's the family reunion. That's the family reunion. That's what that is.
And there's always that cousin, if you know what I mean. And so that cousin.
I'm sorry, guys. I apologize. I probably should have thought of dual sourcing before I used it. How do I get out of that one?
Well, that might be called, betrayal. I don't know.
Yeah.
Oh, stomach.
I think we're gonna stop the analogies right here. We're wading into some dangerous territory with the dual supplier, but
sometimes marriage ends in divorce, unfortunately, and that's what can happen. So
it can, it does. We actually ended up fixing the problem with that supplier. Honestly, we fixed it. We didn't have a choice. But look, I want to, if you guys would allow me. So the framework, so that it's not kind of nebulous and it kind of gets lost into the great discussion we're having. Select, develop, monitor. Select a supplier, develop a supplier, monitor a supplier. Keep the linkages between the three. Now, the reason I wanted to re-articulate this is because a lot of organizations will usually initially have a hard time rationalizing the investment around supplier management framework and structure. This is a structure that has struggled over time to find its place in an organization. Some companies call it supplier development. Some companies call it supplier quality. Some companies would call it anything. Purchasing takes care of it. Sometimes it falls into manufacturing operations, and some people call it inspection, product inspection. So look, the value proposition, as we've articulated earlier, 70 to 80% of your BOM, about 40 to 50% of your spend is, of your revenue is usually in spend with suppliers. And then if you have a model that have a select, develop, monitor, and doing a triangulation between that, the value proposition you will have in investing in this strategic and competitive advantage framework within your organization is unbelievably high. It has an impact on your MPIs. It has an impact on your current manufacturing resiliency. It has an impact on your product performance out in the field. So my message here is do not underestimate and don't set aside and make little of leaning forward in terms of investing in supplier management, and put a structure around it and hold it accountable to delivering the outcome that we're all looking for, supply chain resiliency.
All right, Abe, fantastic interview. Great job. Thanks for giving us a little bit of a look inside what's happening with the manufacturers and their suppliers and manufacturers that are behind them, and how to start having this kind of end-to-end transparency thought process, and how to be a good partner with healthcare providers and organizations, because that's really what it's ultimately all about, taking care of the customer,
Absolutely.
From that perspective. So, Abe, great job today. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, guys. It's very nice to meet you all.
That was Abe Salloum, former senior executive with GE and Garry. We had some fun with Abe today. It was a good conversation, but also just knowing a little bit about what's going on, kind of in the background. You love to talk about over the ocean, or OTO. It's an acronym that you use frequently, especially recently, because it's had such an impact on the supply chain, and it's been part of the conversations that we've been having on many of our recent episodes. But that has a big impact, and especially when it's a complex medical device or a large piece of capital equipment. There's so many parts and pieces. And so obviously Abe's very familiar with that, working with GE in the past, but knowing what's going on behind the scenes. And I think it's encouraging the transparency. And while Abe says for manufacturers or the OEMs to really lean forward into engaging and managing their suppliers, I think those same lessons apply on the healthcare side. Getting that alignment with, how you deliver care with how products are manufactured, I think is really important.
Absolutely, Justin. I think you summed it up very nicely. Abe can present, and Abe is really academic when I heard him speak. He could take it from point A to point B to point C, but the key components I think that he brought up, the transformation, the agility, the transparency that Hayes brought into the conversation. I think that Abe really commented on that, the relationship as it should be in supply chain to the vendor and the OEM moving forward. It's a new status quo, and I think Abe nailed that down even more so moving forward on what it looks like. So just great dialogue, what it looks like, the transparency from a supplier to the hospitals. It was just a really good interview with Abe, and his knowledge is very deep. So this is a great conversation.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for this week's episode. But as a reminder, you can help support Power Supply by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. We're also on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or simply search for Power Supply on your favorite podcast application. We also have bonus content for certain episodes, but you can't access it unless you download our smartphone app for either iPhone or Android. While you're there in the marketplace or in the App Store, we'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review, because your feedback is important to the show. And speaking of feedback, if you have any ideas for guests or topics that you'd like to hear on the Power Supply podcast, just send an email on over to info@powersupplymedia.net. And on behalf of Hayes and Garry and myself, thanks for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply.